What is going on there? Somebody please tell Corbyn to listen to my talks. The conflict escalation problem with Scotland is that the Brexit nightmare of Theresa May and her Tory cronies has reinforced every single negative image of Westminster control of Scotland that I encountered during the referendum in 2014. And it comes after like a couple of centuries or more of Scotland feeling that they're the junior partner in an unfair alliance, and that the English particularly have been taken for granted and overruling their instincts, which are essentially kind of left of centre communitarianism, social solidarity, a big kind of commitment to the community, which goes back to the old Celtic Druid system of community, and you work with the land, you work in harmony with the gods, with nature, with the seasons, which are pretty raw in Scotland. You have to survive. I mean, the winters I endured in Argyll were my political education into what it's like to be Scottish. And that's why love is the absolute crucial virtue for the Scots. Brexit isn't coming from love, it's coming from fear and from hatred and ignorance. And the Scots, therefore, are extremely likely, I would say it's 99.9 recurring, to vote for, no, in fact it's 100% certain, they would vote for independence in a second referendum. And they will agitate for that, and they will demand it within, well, they've already demanded it. They're already agitating for it. And they would legislate for it through their parliament within a day of Brexit going through. In fact, if Boris Johnson and his Brexit loonies seize power in Westminster and force it on Scotland, they'll legislate for it before Brexit happens, and they'll probably arrange it with their allies in Europe in time that as Brexit happens, Scotland leaves the UK and stays in Europe. That's the simplest and easiest way for Scotland. And if I was Nicola Sturgeon, that's what I would be planning. And I'm absolutely sure she's having those discussions with people in Brussels. Scotland doesn't want to leave the European Union because they like Europe. They're a European culture. Lots of European Union people come to Scotland and freely go back and forth, and have done for centuries. The French and the Scots have strong cultural ties. There are links between Scottish academia and French and German and Czech and Italian universities. The Scots have a very open-minded approach to Europe. There are many parts of the Highlands which are populated with seasonal workers coming from the European Union, working in the tourist industry and so on. And they love it. Scotland's very beautiful. I have lots of friends in France that can't wait to go and spend time in Scotland. And then vice versa. The Scots like to come to France. There's a little place around the corner from where I live called Chateau Écosse, Scottish castle, which goes back to the old times during the 100 Years' War, when the Scots sometimes they supported the French, because they knew that the English really can't be trusted. And the English were doing war crimes during that 100 Years' War. The Black Prince slaughtered the people of Limoges, for instance. They've still not forgiven the English. So the escalation is very simple. The Scots would vote for independence. The English might do a Spanish versus Catalan thing on them, and Westminster would say, but that's a fake referendum, doesn't count. The Scots would say, oh yes it does, we're leaving. Whereupon the English say, no it doesn't, we own the country, And then you get tanks moving up the M6 as the English army invades Scotland to impose direct rule. What a nightmare scenario. But I assure you, it's possible. It's possible because the Scots are stubborn. There's no way they will shift from their stated desire for independence. And the English, once they've figured out what's at stake, like, hang on, we lose our nuclear bases in Argyll, we lose all that lovely terrain to train the army in, we lose all that coastline in case of a Third World War, nothing to defend the Atlantic with, we lose all the Atlantic seaports. We lose Oban and Shetland, and can't have that. No, send the tanks in. So I mean, it would be. There's a chance of escalation very rapidly. Okay, if it didn't come to military escalation, it would be fought out in the law courts. The UK Westminster lot would make it as difficult as possible for the Scots to get independence. They would legislate against any referendum legislation going through the Scottish Parliament. They'd say, no, you don't have the right to do that. Here, we slap bills on you all. They would then make it very difficult to negotiate who gets which bits of the North Sea oil, which is a huge thing that's at stake here. And the British would do all they can, the English would do all they can to kind of move the line as far north as possible so that they get more than the Scots. And that this would all be fought out in the courts. You can see it would be the most horrendous escalation of stuff going on. So, and eventually, I'm pretty sure the Scots would get complete and total independence, which is any Scotsman worth their salt won't settle for less this time round, because after this Brexit nightmare, if it's finally done from Westminster, they will be so seething, hopping mad, they will leave the UK. The English some of them will try and prevent them, even up to the point of military intervention. The English have been spying on the Scottish national movement since it was set up. Files have just surfaced from the 1920s and 30s that MI5 sent spies in to spy on Scottish nationalists and to make them look bad in the press and all the rest of it. And no doubt all that dirty tricks bureau would be ratcheted up. And I suspect that's why Alex Salmond has been so denigrated and, claims of sexual this, that and the other, like with Assange. That's what the system does. If someone actually pokes their head above the parapet, it's a way of silencing their support. And that would happen. No doubt we discover that all the Scottish national leaders are, doing unmentionable things. But of course it would all be propaganda as to what the Westminster politicians are doing. I mean, that is seriously covered up, isn't it? But so the escalation would be horrendous. And for anyone that loves the idea, I still have this romantic attachment to the idea of a United Kingdom, you see. I grew up in the United Kingdom. I have roots and deep affection for all parts of it. I would seriously be sad to see it break up. But it will. And the Scots, if the Irish don't do it, and they will, but the Scots will also do it. And the escalation would be, potentially, as I say, there is a chance it could be dealt with peacefully. Scotland could just leave and everyone's happy. But the chances are the English media and the English nationalists, the kind of people that support the EDF, the Tommy Robinsons, the Farage voters, are so fanatical they would probably fight Scotland. And there are some of those types in Scotland itself. There are hard right unionists that so again we might have a civil war situation on our hands even north of the border in Scotland. Just with the Ulster unionists, so the Scottish unionists would create a sort of faction, keep the UK together, fight rather than independence. And there's a risk of that happening. Because you do have both communities in Scotland. Now, again, all I can say, and I'm simply speaking as an academic expert in conflict resolution, is that why would you set out on a path that is likely at all to lead to conflict escalation? It seems to me immoral in the highest extreme of any politician to deliberately set down a path that is going to, it has a strong probability of conflict escalation. So that's why I think that all the people that have been pushing for Brexit in the United Kingdom as a whole, but particularly in England, have got it wrong. They've not done their homework. They haven't thought this through, and it's partly because the media have not been telling them how it is. And Murdoch, he doesn't know the details of all this stuff. He doesn't live in Britain. He doesn't have a clue about British politics. Nor does Trump. He thinks Scotland is a nice place you go for golf courses. You know, these people are completely clueless when it comes to the realities of what it's like to live in Glasgow and you know, love your country, which is Scotland, right? So I'm just warning, I'm just saying, conflict escalation, trigger point number 2, right? Now I'm going to come to trigger point number 3, which is Wales. And I lived in Wales for 10 years or so. I love Wales, it's my other half. I have a big heart, so you know, at least half of it is in Wales. And I did my doctoral thesis, I wrote it up in Wales, while I was teaching at Oxford. And then I trained as a religious studies teacher in Wales. So I worked at Builth Wales, I worked at Llandrindod Wales, I was head of religious studies in Welsh schools, and I got to know the Welsh mind, the Welsh kids. You know, I love them, they're amazing, highly intelligent. My tutor in religious studies, Dr. Bernard Jones, was a great scholar of English at Builth Wales School. He's probably still teaching there. He was a friend of Ted Ragg, who's the great professor of education at Exeter. I don't think he's with us anymore. You know, these are seriously deep and wonderful people. And the Welsh, they've realised that Brexit is not in their interest either. The Welsh have finally woken up. They've got a new Plaid Cymru leader who's a clever man, who's going around rallying the Welsh to say, look, we've got to stop Brexit. It's an absolute nightmare. And one strategy to stop it is independence. Now, this is a movement that is deep in Wales. It goes back a long way. And I studied Welsh history when I lived there, and I wrote a cultural encyclopedia of the Welsh marches. I used to lecture at Shrewsbury Museum and also Montgomery. And I did a lot of research into the history of the marches. And, you know, the Welsh, they were a fierce, independent Celtic group of nations until they were conquered, finally, by the skin of their teeth, by these Anglo-Norman conquerors. Edward I came in and you know, built a load of castles like Carnarvon to hold them down. And he also very naughtily and rudely burned a lot of their ancient books and persecuted, you know, Welsh independence leaders and so on. So the Welsh have never forgiven them for that. And a lot of Druid law was lost, which is unforgivable. Which is why, you know, Iorla Morgannwg and so on struggled to get a few scraps that were still left. Then it flared up again in 1403 with Owen Glendower led a revolt. Now he was a good man, a Welshman. He'd studied in London. He knew, he knew Chaucer. He knew the king, King Richard King Richard II, who was a very cultured and learned man, actually, old Richard, and he was a great peace thinker. And he was friends with a Frenchman who had this proposal for like a European Union back in the 1400s. He wanted France and England to unite as one nation, and then the other countries of Europe could join in too, and it would guarantee peace. He was a personal friend of King Richard II, who I used to play in Shakespeare's, part. It's a great play. And Owen Glendower was loyal to him, as was Chaucer and other people. Unfortunately, this upstart called Bolingbroke seized the crown and had Richard killed. And Owen Glendower went off into the Welsh hills and sulked. And Bolingbroke kind of was friends with some other local lord. I mean, the whole history is very interesting. I won't go into it all. And eventually, and they tried to pinch Owen Glendower's lands, right, which is right on the border, near where Gladstone left his library at Harden, which I've studied in. And so Glendower said, enough is enough. You know, these these English are mad. And so he started a rebellion. He started an armed rebellion, which was extremely successful. And they fought the English and they kicked them out of Wales. And there's an amazing history there. And he founded a parliament in Machynlleth, which is a beautiful little town in mid Wales. And, you know, that was it, really. English were gone. Until the Battle of Shrewsbury, which went disastrously from the Welsh point of view. Owen Glendower didn't turn up at the battle. He was hiding apparently up a tree and watched it from a distance. And Henry IV and his son, who became Henry V, smashed the people who'd come all the way from Northumberland, the Hotspur army, and slaughtered them with arrows. It was the first major arrow battle in British history. And I organised an exhibition at Shrewsbury Museum about this. This is why I've studied all this, commemorating it in 2003. So it was like the 600th anniversary, 1403 to 1603. And it was the start of this English imperialism. Henry V then launched his great Agincourt, using the same tactics, arrow battles, which is kind of cheating, really. And that sort of idea of, England is the best country in the world type thing caught on. But the Welsh never bought into it. And Owen Glendower was never captured. He remained elusive. He retired. He became a scholar. He was a bit of a druid, was old Owen. And there are legends that, he was spotted. And I know people in Wales that have family traditions that he used to stay in their tower and things. And that Welsh yearning for independence is still there. And to be honest, I've been watching the signs and I've been picking up the clues, and I can see that yearning, hiraeth it's called, this yearning for the homeland, it can also operate when your homeland is oppressed. The Brexit types who are pushing for it, the Farage types, the danger of escalation is that the Welsh will also want independence. And I think all the signs are that is coming sooner rather than later. And I think they're entitled to it. And I personally, if I was living in Wales, I would be, saying that if they're going to do Brexit, if they're going to push this through without a second referendum, without reconsulting the people, which is the fair way of dealing with this, because after all, the Welsh did, by a small majority, vote in favour of Brexit. Well, I think they're entitled to change their mind now they see what a nightmare it is. And if they then vote to stay in the European Union, then they should. And if that means doing Scotland and leaving the UK, then so be it. I think the Welsh and the Scots should just go ahead and have a second referendum anyway, really. I don't see why they can't organise it. That would give some legitimacy to a second independence, or in the case of Wales, a first independence vote. But anyway, so the danger of escalation is, of course, then there would be other people that would say, no, we can't let the Welsh independent. No, look, you can't let all those holiday cottages go. And God, what about the water that keeps Liverpool alive? What about all the water of Wales? No, we can't let them go, so we'll send the tanks in. and it might well escalate. I know it sounds ridiculous, but politics unfortunately has this, as Thomas Hobbes observed, this tendency that given polarisation, conflict can escalate very quickly. And there've been flashpoints on the Anglo-Welsh border before, and it wouldn't take much to escalate. And so again, that's my third warning. That's a third possible escalation point. If Brexit is imposed, if it's disastrous, if Welsh industry collapses, look, the British steel industry is collapsing. If Wales just ends up with nothing but a series of empty high streets and poundland shops, with no industry and everyone's left the country, I'm sorry, they will go for independence in their own interests, and good luck to them. Because being part of the European Union is not taking that route. It's being part of a vibrant, the largest free market in the world, the largest common market of 500 million people. And, it's a nice place to be, as I can vouch for. So, no, I think there is a potential escalation point. Which again, I just ask, who in their right minds would pursue a policy that could lead to such escalation? Okay, the final of the 4 escalation points I want to come to is England itself. Because both my parents were mainly English. My father was half Irish, but I know England extremely well, and I understand it's quite a class-ridden society. It always has been, and if Brexit is not put back to the people to make a second choice, I fear that it's going to escalate into almost like a civil war situation in England itself. Now, it's got pretty bad with verbal abuse on the internet and stuff, and with shouting at marches and demos, and with jockeying, and I mean, I suppose in a sense there have been deaths. The Labour MP that was a strong campaigner for Remain was shot, was she not? And other people have I mean, I have a friend who might well have been murdered. He was an extreme Brexit opposer, supporting the campaign against Brexit, and he was found dead in mysterious circumstances. So, there have been casualties, but I think it might get worse because, and the ones I fear mostly are the extreme Brexiteers who seem to have a tendency to violence in their demonstrations. In their marches, they tend to like to throw stuff around. And there's a lot of anger being fueled in this Brexit lot, which is, I mean, it's completely, I believe, fueled deliberately from outside. I don't think that it's, homegrown, so to speak. I mean, I have my theories as to why the whole Brexit thing was shaped in the way that it was, and we know that it was American money that paid for the 2016 referendum result. I think that the whole thing is a sort of geopolitical ploy by American intelligence to break off the UK from the European Union, to advance their own geostrategic interests, and I can demonstrate that with a series of analytical steps. I'm not going to go into that now. I'm not talking conspiracy theory here, I'm talking conspiracy history. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I'm a conspiracy historian. And, I've joined the dots of some historical research on this. However, that's not the point I want to make here. The point I want to make is that the extremisms that have been engineered over the Brexit nightmare. I mean, we've got Farage and people already saying they're going to take up rifles. We've got allegations of violence, by them. We've got evidence that the hard right, which is what is behind them and supporting them, is prone to violence. And when fascism and Nazism walked the streets of Europe, they started violence. They wouldn't, immediately do that, but it's possible. And the more people like me, the more Remain voices there are. And if we were to win a second referendum, let's say, and if Parliament stands up against the Brexit Party and its nightmares, that disgruntled minority, which is what it is, it's a minority, and very angry, might well attempt some kind of coup or civil disobedience, civil riots, whatever, we don't know. I would hope not. I hope this thing can be dealt with constitutionally and in a parliamentary democracy and so on. But there is a danger of escalation. Now, you see, if the true facts had been told to the British public all along, if the dangers of Scotland and Northern Ireland and even Wales had been laid out, we wouldn't have got here. We wouldn't have got to this point. It wouldn't have got this bad. It would have been obvious that we're facing a potential Yugoslav-type internal dismemberment of our country, and people would have said, most normal, decent English people would have said, well, that's ridiculous then. I'm not going to pursue this Brexit nonsense. It's because of the deceit and the lies from the media that we haven't been told these facts, that this Brexit lobby have been allowed to whip up such a head of steam. I hold the BBC to some extent deliberately responsible for this, and I've written to the Director General of the BBC asking how they made that decision. And I've just been stonewalled. I will pursue it. So the danger, this is my next flashpoint. So let's say the danger is that, let's say that hard right lot, agitate, come out on the street, start doing riots and so on, a few killings, stabbings. Well, and the police sort of, try and stop them. And then it escalates. I mean, I think, we would end up in a potential kind of civil war type environment, which is just a thought that is horrendous. And let's say that, so Scotland has its referendum and starts to secede, Northern Ireland does, but the hardcore Irish, lot say, no, we're going to fight. So you're going to get the Farage lot ferrying guns over to the Ulster Protestants, ferrying guns and rifles up to the Glasgow hardline, right-wing Unionists. And before you know it, there's going to be a sort of pall of smoke over the British Isles as the whole thing hits pear-shape. So the escalation potential is not just in the Celtic fringe, it hits right back to London. And there'll be the kind of left, liberal, social democrat, green types in England will say, well, Scots want to go, fine, let them go. Northern Ireland, let them go. But the hard right, fanatics for Brexit will say no, and will use force to support the kind of unionists, as they would be called, from preventing a breakup of the UK. And they would say it's their duty, they're patriots. This is why the dangerous rhetoric Theresa May has been coming out with has been stoking this. She hasn't, so either she hasn't worked it out, or she just is very deliberately being mischievous. Okay, so that's my fourth flashpoint, which is a civil war in England itself, unless Brexit is prevented through a democratic process of a second referendum. Okay, those are my four flashpoints, and I'm speaking simply, as I say, as I said at the beginning of this talk, after years of reflection on peace and the philosophy of peace, and then years of studying scientifically how you prevent conflict. What you don't do, having heard these four potential flashpoints, you don't then say, oh, to hell with it, we're doing Brexit anyway, the people voted. That's like a mantram that is, oh dear. It's just flying in the face of all the evidence, all the arguments of reason, and all the ethics of peace. I suppose, so there are two types of people that would say, no, we're doing Brexit anyway, unfortunately, the majority of them won't listen to this talk. They would ignore it. It's different. I don't know how to reach out. I've taught thousands of people in my life, but I don't know how else to get this message through, these four escalation points. I would like this to be discussed in every single pub in England and Britain. I'd like this to be discussed in every single school in England, and every single church and theology faculty and university. That's why I've set up this Centre for Bremain Studies here, and I'd like participation and active engagement with political scientists. What I'm saying is not airy-fairy, it's not fantasy land, it's not fake news, it's factually based. This is the most likely scenario. Let me just say a little bit more about that in political science terms. I have a good friend, Shlomo Soham, who is in Israel. He was a judge, he's retired now, who I interviewed for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, which I set up inspired by the work of Britain and Ireland. And he has written a book called Future Intelligence. He was an officer attached to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, which looks at long-term perspectives of the future. So his job as a judge was to look at all the bills coming into the Israeli parliament and to look at them from the perspective of 7 generations down the line. Does this stand up? Is this a wise piece of legislation? Will our ancestors, our descendants 7 generations from now, thank us in the Knesset for passing this bill? And he was an ombudsman attached to the Parliament who had the right to stamp the bill, no, rethink it. He couldn't block it, but he could ask the parliamentarians to rethink it. And he would give us reasons. And that is what's called future intelligence. Looking at things a very long-term perspective. Now, Shlomo's part of a network. There's an ombudsman in Sweden that does the same thing. I think there should be such a thing in the British Parliament. I think they've got one in Wales. I believe the Welsh Assembly now has a sort of future intelligence type ombudsman person, and there should be one in all. So what I'm saying about these conflict escalation points is that a fundamental part of future intelligence is you don't legislate for stuff that and have been assured by academic experts that the likelihood is very high that it will escalate. I mean, with Northern Ireland, I would say the escalation is like 100% likely. The escalation with Scotland is high, is kind of 85%. The escalation with Wales, again, 70-75% likely within a few years. And again, the English Civil War type scenario, again, quite likely. I don't know, 60-65%. Now, having got those figures, looking at this calculus, the future intelligence officer would say, this Brexit thing's got to be stopped. And what we should be thinking through, and what genuine parliamentarians would be doing now, and they are, I mean, I've worked in the British Parliament running meetings on ethics and policy, actually. And if I was calling another meeting in Parliament with a Lord, we used to meet in the House of Lords, in the committee rooms, we would be saying, how can we ethically and wisely, as soon as possible, stop Brexit? Well, the most ethical way of doing it is to have a second referendum, because it was that's what triggered it. So there should really be a second referendum, and I think the majority of MPs realise that, have come round to that position, and the vast majority of people in the UK have come to that. The people who don't want it, and I hope that after listening to this talk that even more will come round to that perspective. Now, there may be some people that still don't want it, and I think they fall generally into 2 categories. There are people that cannot hear what I'm saying, that don't believe it, that don't have the imagination to think it through, don't have an educational ability to recognise this problem of the cycles of escalating conflict. It's a specialised field not many people have ever thought of or looked at. I can assure you the literature is there. I can send you a reading list, and what I'm saying I think would be backed up by every single professor of political science who knows about conflict studies and peace studies. And it's a growing field. There are a lot of people, say, in Scotland at the University in St Andrews and Oxford. There's a big centre now, which looks at political science and conflict and war, actually, and the triggers for war. The most important duty I think we have is to prevent war, and at least 2 of these conflict scenarios, well, potentially all 4 of them, these escalation points, they have potential to develop into wars. Certainly one of them, I think, pretty rapidly, the Ireland one. So possibly just, don't want to hear, can't hear, don't have the means to understand it, don't believe it, shut up, go away type attitude. And I've encountered that, obviously. And that is fed by the media. So if you're reading the Daily Mail